Welcome to Paranormal Northwest, a podcast all about the history and the paranormal of the Pacific Northwest. Join me as I tell stories of this great region, the history, the people who live here, and those who may have never left. This episode is a tangent episode to our last episode covering Albion State Normal School. When researching most topics, I end up going down different rabbit holes and want to dive into so many other topics. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. It's my podcast, and I'll do what I want to. With that, I want to take a dive down the Hells Canyon Massacre. Join me in this look into a dark period of Snake River history. So, grab your sweater, your blanket, and a cup of tea, and let's get started. Part of having a podcast and YouTube channel is having a platform to disperse information. While that information is often for entertainment, we sometimes encounter a story that must be told. This is one such story. When starting this research, I was met often with terms like the forgotten massacre and the massacre lost to history. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest and an avid history consumer, I am well aware of the many atrocities the Chinese immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century were exposed to. However, not many are. By sharing this story, I hope to remember the memory of those men who lost their lives for simply being. Chinese immigration to the United States in the 19th century began in significant numbers during the California gold rush of the 1840s and 50s. Thousands of Chinese immigrants, mainly from the Guangdong province, came in search of economic opportunities, hoping to strike it rich in the gold fields. Many also worked in agriculture and later in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad during the 1860s. Despite their contributions, Chinese immigrants faced widespread discrimination and hostility. Many Americans viewed them as economic threats, leading to rising anti-Chinese sentiment, particularly in the western states. This culminated in several discriminatory laws, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which severely restricted Chinese immigration and barred Chinese immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens. This act marked the first significant immigration restriction based on ethnicity in the U.S. history and was a direct result of the nativist and xenophobic attitudes that grew during this period. Chinese communities, or Chinatowns, began forming in urban areas like San Francisco, where immigrants sought safety from violence and discrimination. These enclaves helped preserve cultural traditions, but were also viewed suspiciously by outsiders. The exclusion laws remained in effect until they were repealed in 1943. However, Chinese immigrants' labor and cultural influence left a lasting impact on the U.S. economy and society, despite the hardships they faced. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a landmark piece of U.S. legislation that marked the first time the U.S. government explicitly restricted immigration based on race or nationality. It was enacted in response to growing anti-Chinese sentiment, particularly in the western United States, where Chinese immigrants were seen as economic competition for jobs, especially in sectors like mining, agriculture, and railroad construction. So the ban on immigration. The act barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States for a period of 10 years, although certain groups such as diplomats, teachers, students, merchants, and tourists were exempt from the ban. The law also prevented Chinese immigrants already in the United States from becoming naturalized citizens, meaning they could not vote or participate fully in civic life. Any Chinese immigrants who left the United States had to obtain special re-entry permits to return, making travel extremely difficult for them. Many cite different reasons for its passage. Many white workers, particularly in California, blamed Chinese laborers for driving down wages and taking jobs. Chinese immigrants, often willing to work for lower wages in industries like railroad construction, agriculture, and factory work, were seen as competitors. There was also a strong racial and cultural bias against Chinese immigrants, who were perceived as unassimilable and inferior. This was reflected in widespread anti-Chinese violence, such as riots and massacres. Labor organizations like the Working Men's Party of California played a major role in pushing for the exclusion of Chinese workers, using inflammatory rhetoric and blaming them for unemployment and economic instability. Though originally intended to last only 10 years, the act was renewed and expanded multiple times. First being the Geary Act in 1892, which extended the exclusion for another 10 years and required Chinese residents to carry a certificate of residence at all times or face deportation. Then in 1902 was the extension to permanent law. This ban on Chinese immigration was made permanent, and Chinese immigrants were further excluded from bringing their families to the United States. These restrictions were tightened over time, making it extremely difficult for Chinese immigrants to enter the United States, reunite with their families, or find legal recourse to challenge their exclusions. The impact to the Chinese American community is lasting to this day. The Chinese Exclusion Act had devastating effects on the Chinese American community. Chinese Americans were largely isolated and segregated into Chinatowns, where they lived under constant threat of violence and harassment. With limited legal rights and no path to citizenship, many Chinese workers were trapped in low-paying jobs, faced discrimination in court, and were often scapegoated for broader economic problems. Family separation became common as many Chinese men who had come to the United States were unable to bring their wives or children due to the restrictions on immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act remained in place for over 60 years until it was finally repealed in 1943 during World War II, when China became an ally of the United States against Japan. The repeal allowed Chinese immigrants to become naturalized citizens, but strict quotas still limited the number of Chinese immigrants who could enter the United States. Full immigration reform came later with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which abolished the national origins quota system and allowed for greater numbers of immigrants from Asia. The Chinese Exclusion Act is often cited as a dark chapter in U.S. immigration history and a foundational moment in the development of modern American immigration policy. It set a precedent for racialized immigration restrictions that would later be applied to other groups, such as Japanese and Southern and Eastern Europeans. In 2012, the United States Congress passed a formal resolution expressing regret for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act and acknowledging the discrimination and suffering it caused. The act was a critical turning point in U.S. immigration history, shaping national attitudes and policies regarding race, labor, and national identity for decades. During the 19th century, the Chinese played a significant role in the mining industry in Oregon, particularly during the gold rush period. After gold was discovered in southwestern Oregon in the 1850s, a wave of miners, including a large number of Chinese immigrants, flocked to the region. By the 1860s, Chinese miners had established themselves in southern and eastern Oregon, primarily in places like Jackson, Josephine, and Baker counties. Chinese immigrants initially came to Oregon to work as laborers, but soon became heavily involved in gold mining. After many American and European miners had extracted the more easily accessible gold, Chinese miners took over these abandoned claims. They used more efficient methods of mining, such as placer mining, to recover gold from areas that had been deemed unprofitable by others. The Chinese miners were particularly skilled in placer mining, which involves washing soil or gravel to extract gold. Over time, they became known for their use of hydraulic techniques and sluicing, which allowed them to recover small quantities of gold from areas that had been overlooked by non-Chinese miners. These methods helped them succeed in otherwise marginal claims. The Chinese miners faced significant discrimination and hostility from European and American miners. Anti-Chinese sentiment was widespread, and Chinese workers were often relegated to the least profitable or most physically demanding mining sites. Many local communities implemented discriminatory taxes, such as the foreign miners' tax, which targeted Chinese workers and forced them to pay additional fees simply to work claims. Chinese miners often worked in large organized groups. They were known for pooling resources and labor to work claims efficiently, with profits shared communally. These groups, called Kongzi, enabled the Chinese to undertake more extensive mining operations. They often leased or bought claims that had been abandoned by non-Chinese miners, and their collaborative approach allowed them to maximize gold extraction from the land. By the 1800s, or the 1900s, as the profitability of gold mining declined, many Chinese miners diversified into other industries such as farming, railroad construction, and businesses serving mining communities. They also engaged in other forms of mineral extraction, including coal mining, though gold remained their primary focus during the height of the rush. Although the Chinese miners faced many hardships, they contributed significantly to the economic development of Oregon during the gold rush period. Their efforts in marginal and difficult claims helped extend the life of mining operations in regions that might otherwise have been abandoned. Today, the contributions of Chinese miners are acknowledged in historical accounts of Oregon's mining industry, though they were often marginalized or overlooked in earlier histories. In the later decades of the 19th century, many Chinese miners left Oregon due to the increased hostility and anti-Chinese legislation, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which, as already discussed, restricted further immigration and made life extremely difficult for those already in the United States. Despite this, the influence of Chinese labor in the development of Oregon's mining industry remains an important part of the state's history. The Hells Canyon Massacre, also known as the Snake River Massacre, was a tragic event that occurred in May 1887 in a remote area of northeastern Oregon, along the Snake River in Hells Canyon. The massacre resulted in the deaths of approximately 34 Chinese gold miners who were brutally murdered by a gang of horse thieves and outlaws. This event is one of the darkest and least known episodes in the history of Chinese immigration to the United States, and it reflects the intense racism and violence faced by Chinese workers during the late 19th century. In the 1880s, Chinese miners were working claims in the rugged and remote region of Hells Canyon, which is part of the Snake River bordering Oregon and Idaho. These miners had come to the United States to work in gold mining, agriculture, and railroad construction. By the time of the massacre, many of the easily accessible gold deposits had already been worked over by earlier miners, and the Chinese were known for taking over claims that others had abandoned. The Chinese miners at the Snake River site were primarily placer miners, extracting gold from the river and its banks. They typically worked in isolated and dangerous areas, which made them vulnerable to violence and exploitation. At the time, anti-Chinese sentiment was strong in the American West, leading to widespread discrimination, legal persecution, and violence against Chinese immigrants. The massacre occurred when a group of white horse thieves and outlaws, believed to be led by 3 young men, set out to rob and murder the Chinese miners. The exact number of perpetrators remains unclear, but they ambushed the Chinese workers who were camped along the Snake River. The miners were attacked with rifles and pistols, and some were shot as they tried to flee or swim across the river. After the murders, the killers reportedly mutilated some of the bodies, and many of the dead were thrown into the river. The attackers then stole a substantial amount of gold dust from the miners, with estimates of the gold ranging from $4,000 to $50,000, a largely significant amount at the time. After the massacre, the killers fled, and the event went largely unnoticed for some time due to the remoteness of location and the marginalized status of the Chinese victims. However, the massacre came to light when the mutilated bodies of the Chinese miners were found in the river, floating farther downstream. Local residents and authorities were alerted, but due to the anti-Chinese sentiment of the time, little effort was initially made to investigate the crime thoroughly or bring the killers to justice. Eventually, the killers were identified, and an investigation was launched by local authorities. In 1888, 3 of the suspected murderers, Robert McMillan, Bruce Evans, and Frank Vaughn, were indicted for the crime, but none were ever convicted. The trial, held in Walla County, Oregon, was characterized by racism and a lack of interest in seeking justice for the Chinese victims. The jurors were reluctant to convict the defendants, and as a result, no one was ever held accountable for the massacre. For many years, the Hells Canyon Massacre was largely forgotten and ignored in American history, particularly because the victims were Chinese immigrants. However, in recent decades, efforts have been made to acknowledge this tragic event and its place in the broader narrative of racial violence in the American West. Historians, scholars, and community leaders have worked to uncover the details of the massacre and memorialize the victims. In 2005, a memorial was erected at the site of the massacre in Hells Canyon. The memorial is located at a place called Chinese Massacre Cove, and it commemorates the lives of the miners who were killed in the attack. The massacre is now recognized as a grim reminder of the hostility and violence faced by Chinese immigrants during the late 19th century. While the history of the Pacific Northwest is filled with stories of excitement, loss, and discovery, we owe it to those who came before us to remember all of their stories, good and bad. Thank you for joining me as we explored another important piece of Pacific Northwest history. If you have stories of your own to share, follow me on social media at ParaNWPod and message or comment on a post. Until next time, bye.